I'm Rihanna Patrick. This is Blak Nation. I'm not going to lie, I've been extremely lucky in my working life that I've been privy to conversations I wouldn't normally hear, and which I only heard because of what I was working on in my former radio life. These conversations were around making lasting change in various sectors, which I'd never worked in and I know little about. So when I came to what a debut IndigenousX podcast series could look like, I knew it was these discussions I'd heard over the years or read in articles that I wanted to explore more. A way of hearing about how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were thinking about different ways to make change in the spaces they worked, how they were marking their work landscapes in a way which left a continuing legacy of work for future generations. While I knew this is what I wanted to do with this podcast, I was struggling to give it a name. It got me thinking, though, about those early examples of Indigenous independent media who were doing work like IndigenousX long before Twitter and online publishing was a thing. I wanted this podcast name to connect the present and the past in a way which remembered those who'd had a vision of what media could and should be doing for our community. A future where Indigenous people told their own stories in their own way, through their own platforms, which kept our community informed about the ideas being discussed and the work being done in other parts of the country, whether seen or not. And as Indigenous people, we know the importance of keeping that connection to the past and how that continues to build on the future vision dreamed for us by those who came before. And that thinking led me, and now you, to this podcast, Blak Nation, and a family legacy of Indigenous media.
Blak Nation was a newspaper that was created in 1982 to put out into the world the voices of our community, talking about land rights, talking about a lot of the social issues that our people were facing at the time, including the Queensland Aboriginals Act. It was also, I think, a part of the process of the protests that happened around the 82 Commonwealth Games, and my dad did it.
That's Teela Watson. Her father, Uncle Ross Watson, started the Blak Nation newspaper as a way of keeping the Brisbane community informed. His big sister, Auntie Lilla Watson, remembers the work that he put into it.
Ross saw it as a very important part of what was developing in the community, and he just saw how important it was that we have our own newspaper. He saw it as very important, and he really worked very hard in getting those newspaper printed out.
Thanks to Dr. Lilla, Teela and the Watson family for giving IndigenousX permission to use the name for the podcast. You'll hear more about Uncle Ross Watson's newspaper in an upcoming Blak Nation episode. As you heard, even in 1982, Indigenous visionaries were creating ways of taking up space on our own terms, the continuing legacy of those who opened the doors to the world we now find ourselves in. Some things have changed. Something which hasn't is the continued critique of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. Since colonisation, our lives have been judged, critiqued and criticised. We're critiqued about how we live, how we spend our money, how we make our money, how we conduct ourselves in public, our belief systems, our research, how we create art and how we express ourselves in it. Which got me thinking, does the work we create need to be critiqued by our own community? What even is the place of criticism and critique in our arts community? And most importantly, are we ready to be critiqued by our own? Someone else who was also thinking about this was Lisa Fuller.
Hi, my name is Lisa Fuller. I'm a Willy woman, also descended from Waka Waka and Gurungurung peoples. I've been living on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands in Canberra since 2006. I am a writer, an academic and a freelance editor.
In October 2020, Lisa wrote an article, Why Culturally Aware Reviews Matter, for independent online magazine Kill Your Darlings. In her article, Lisa wrote about her frustration at the reviews, most of which were positive, for her debut novel, Ghost Bird.
I was in publishing for 7 years, so I kind of knew reviewing was problematic, mostly in non-fiction, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and writers and materials. So there were some really problematic and inappropriate things said about those books, some of those books. And then my book came out and wasn't terrible. it was just inappropriate because it was informed by this literary legacy we have in this country where we use language that minimises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures and spiritual beliefs. And it kind of really got up my nose. You know, the article with KYD, it opens with that conversation that I was constantly having with my mum, who was stalking every single review of my book. And she'd call me and she'd be really excited. I was like, this is a really deadly review, daughter. We'll just, we'll ignore the words that they use because it's some legends and Indigenous and all those things that we hate.
Her frustration was that a lot of the reviewers were unable to understand her spiritual beliefs as an Eidsvold Murray, which featured heavily in the book and is what most reviewers kept referring to in their reviews as myths and legends.
So what happens when a non-Indigenous reviewer does the work to understand the text, and particularly the text that you've written with some of those things that you were talking about in this article?
It's kind of difficult to say from their perspective, but from my perspective, when I feel like they've really understood the cultural differences and their own position and privilege that they come to with it, I feel very much heard and seen. And it's really nice to know that they got it. And, maybe my work is not just entertaining, but educating as well, which is always the hope.
While there's no doubt that culturally aware reviews, as Lisa termed it in her article, would go a long way in changing how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander books are critiqued and how they are approached for a review in the first place, it did get me wondering, what would Ghostbird's reviews have looked like had there been more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander critics?
It's a really interesting question because I have been reviewed by some First Nations peoples, but not many. It's interesting because, I'm part of Us Mob Writing, that's the First Nations writers group here in Canberra, and we're all about supporting each other and we don't really critique each other's work, whereas I'm in a different writers group who has all different kinds of backgrounds and it's much more critical. I don't know, because I think the importance of supporting each other right now, considering we're in this new space and it's growing, and I think that's almost more important at this point. But at the same time, I'm actually a feedback fiend, and it's my debut novel, and I'm sure I've done, things wrong, and I'd love to get more experienced author going, you could improve here. But maybe I'm a bit early in my career for that.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. While having more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literary critics is only one part of creating a Black critique community, it's also important to acknowledge how writing in this country was established in the first place.
Like any form of writing by or about mob, it comes from, a certain historical place.
That's Declan Fry, a Yorta Yorta writer, poet and essayist who was engaged as a critic last year for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. His work has appeared in Meanjin, The Saturday Paper, Overland, and a bunch of other places.
There's actually an interesting map I've seen in The Guardian which visualises it really nicely, and it shows you how much of the Australian continent belonged to First Nations in 1788, that's the whole of it, and then how much of it belonged to First Nations in about mid-60s, which was none of it. And when I say belong, I mean in a legal or in some sort of historical legal sense. And then, post-Mabo, things start coming back. Of course, the existential problem is that the continent has always been one of First Nations stories. And the conflict has been between a colonial literature that emerged post-invasion and attempted to write a new Australian continent.
Declan says that this writing of a new Australian continent meant that the historical inheritance of written First Nations writing is one of protest, a way to assert sovereignty of mind, of language, of imagination, and a way of reinforcing that First Nations stories were always here. Declan says even concepts like terra nullius had a strong hold on literature in this country.
There's a famous quote from the Nobel Prize Committee when they awarded the only Australian author who's so far been awarded the Nobel Prize, Patrick White. His citation said that he'd written a new continent into literature, which is an odd thing to say if you're aware of the ongoing long history of First Nations stories and songlines. It's an odd thing to say that.
Declan says even concepts like terra nullius had a strong hold on literature in this country.
Before Mabo, there was an odd sense that First Nations were ghosts. And, you might have heard that story that when Cook landed mob saw Cook and his party as ghosts, as people who maybe were, I don't know, that they were ghouls or they were people who had some sort of phantasmagoric existence. And so now there's a turning point in trying to say post-Mabo, the stories are here, First Nations, they have an actual existence that has never been ceded, particularly since there hasn't been any historical treaties between colonists and First Nations. There hasn't been any discussion of what this continent is and that sense of having an agreement or a discussion about who writes the continent and what are you writing about when you write about Australia. So in critiquing mob, there's all of that history in mind. But as well as that, of course, this is writing that can be critiqued like any other form of writing across the globe in terms of looking at its style, what the author's trying to do, have they achieved it, the context of the author's work, the context of how that work fits with the author's past writing and writing more broadly in Australia. And I guess the critic will bring their own reading, their own life to bear on that and how they interpret it and how they then choose to write about it. And conveying that to an audience, especially under 1,000 words, is very difficult.
The history of omission and erasure of the Indigenous storytelling canon in this country, which Declan succinctly explained, is but one of the challenges still to be overcome by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers. There's also the challenge of getting your work reviewed in the first place.
Generally speaking, the books are commissioned by an editor. So the reviewer can have some say in what they review, but essentially books are chosen by editors and then given to reviewers to write on. So there is an initial gatekeeping function there about what gets reviewed. And of course, it tends to favour authors who are expected to sell, to be in bookshelf windows. And of course, that's fair. Then there are word constraints. You tend not to have too many words, usually 1,000 and under. And I guess those are the two biggest constraints of reviewing for major or mainstream newspapers. It would be that certain types of work are prioritized, like novels would be king. Then other forms of prose like nonfiction, major publishers, major names, and shorter word counts. Also, there tends to be a desire to contextualize a book or an author. So often they'll mention this person has won these awards, this person's been shortlisted for that, and those things are normally just put in by editors. I don't necessarily write those things, but that background information is seen by editors, I suppose, as necessary context or part of the function of how books are written about in mainstream publications.
There's no doubt that the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors are now sought after by mainstream publishers and are being reviewed by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous critics. But there's one space which continues to lag behind the rest of the arts. When it comes to a void of Indigenous voices being present, the music press has a long way to go. Despite the growth over the last 30 years of Indigenous music, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists making Triple J's Hottest 100, having their music played on mainstream radio, and breaking into the international music charts, there's still a severe lack of regular Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander critics reviewing our own music on our own terms.
My name is Sosefina Fuamoli. I am a music journalist and content creator based in Naarm or Melbourne, and I am a Samoan Australian woman. So born in South Australia, but my dad hails from Western Samoa.
Sos is one of the few Samoan Australian music journalists working regularly in the mainstream music press. She's profiled some of the biggest artists and music festivals in the world, has written for publications including Rolling Stone Australia, NME, Music Feeds and AU Review. In 2020, Sos received the inaugural Live Music Journalist Award at the National Live Music Awards and has sat on the judging panel of some of this country's top music awards like the ARIAs, the National Indigenous Music Awards and the Australian Music Prize. Sos has been in spaces where Indigenous people are yet to set foot in and where few from the Polynesian community have been.
It's been an interesting time in terms of representation, and like proper representation, not like representation in a real tokenistic form. I do feel like things are changing, and artists and other creatives are seeing themselves possibly reflected a lot more than they used to. Certainly when I first started, from seeing more brown faces, seeing some more black faces, it's going to instill just like a rejuvenated sense of confidence that people can put into their art, or people can even have if they're aspiring to kind of enter the arts industry. You know, I feel like that was definitely lacking before, but I'm noticing it changing now.
Sos believes there's a general trust issue when it comes to others critiquing your work as a musician who aren't from your community.
I feel like a lot of people are looking for more voices of critique in mainstream Australian media from people who are part of those communities, whether or not it's as a way to sort of bridge that gap between these cultural groups who haven't really been profiled either in the best light or in the proper light when it comes to, you know, mainstream white media. So kind of as using people like me to be some kind of a gateway to those artists that they wouldn't have had before. I feel like that's a thing. But also from the community's point of view, I do feel like it's a little bit more comforting to see, not necessarily myself personally, but to see people like myself, people like Namila Benson, you know what I mean? People who have an authoritative voice, but also can still relate on that cultural and personable level, you know?
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, have you had an instance of that where being from the background that you're from and, you know, in terms of your identity, that has helped at times in maybe some of those trickier interviews that you've been sent out to do, and that's kind of the thing that has allowed you access that others might not have had, and that understanding of culture even?
I think so. I mean, I did a feature on the Sydney Drill Group on 4 last year. Obviously, they've become prolific in Australia and abroad for both good and bad reasons. And their music is very reflective of the lives that they've lived, you know, in Sydney. And not many people at that point had been able to interview them, or they hadn't been able to kind of broach any sort of interview topics past the music, past the, you know, the sort of gang narrative that has followed them since the beginning of their career. So my aim was to kind of delve a little bit deeper and look at them through the perspective of, you know, young Pacific Islanders who were growing up in a climate that was so far removed from what our parents and grandparents would have gone through. So I was able to get access to them. Straight up, it wasn't the easiest interview, just because I feel like there is a lot of when we grow up in a culture that has put importance on silence keeping us safe, particularly when it comes to growing up in the society that we do here in Australia. There's a lot of trust issues that come with that, and I completely understood that at the time. So at the same time, I wasn't coming in being like, yeah, man, like I come from exactly the same background as you do, because that's definitely not true at all. So it was a real balancing point of trying to get them to open up to me, but also to know that even though I was part of the media, I'm just here to be a vessel to tell their story through, and a vessel where they could feel safe in telling their story through. So in saying that, I don't think many other journalists would have gotten the access that I did, because like I get it that there has been so much that has been said about them that A isn't true, or B is so facetious and surface level, that I don't blame them or their management for being like, we're not going to put them in that situation. So I feel like having that shared cultural background, but also a shared understanding of how hard things can be as an artist to try and break barriers in this industry that is, let's be honest, it hasn't been built to benefit people of colour, you know, far beyond a transactional or tokenistic sphere. Because I kind of understood that, I definitely feel like that played in my favour.
While she acknowledges that critique is crucial to the development of an artist, she says it also plays a vital role in making underrepresented communities visible.
I feel like those are words that we hear a lot in our circles, you know, like it's always going to be a question of visibility, and it's always weirdly intertwined with not only critique but also credibility too. So for what I've been doing, at least over the last 10 years that I've been doing this, I've really tried to make a point of my work and what I do to say, okay, look, I've been given a platform that I know not many other people would get a lot of the time, and I'm in a position where I can try and change things from the inside a little bit. I can use the fact that people see me as a trustworthy voice. I can use the fact that I've got the experience behind me from working across the independent sort of media realm to kind of influence the way that I guess these larger organizations work, even if it's a little bit. I've been smart enough to acknowledge that not everything I'm asked to do is coming from a, we want to book you for your talent alone sort of thing. So although that's something that I still kind of wrestle with a little bit with myself. I think we all do. Like, I know you've definitely,
we've all been there.
We've all been there, but it's just like, I've got to think of the long game, and I've got to think of the fact that there might be some other, younger Polynesian writers out there who would see me on a panel, or they could, read my byline and be like, oh, wow, I'm starting to see her in more places. I'm starting to see those doors opening up more for me. So that's really important to me. And I feel like I've put a lot of my internal baggage and trauma aside in recent years, because I'm like, I now can see that things are beginning to change. The wheels are beginning to turn a bit more. So I need to just kind of ride that momentum and try and affect things to my community in the best way that I can with the resources I can.
It's clear that the place of critique is far more complex than just a work being reviewed or getting some level of promotion because of it. For the Indigenous community, it's a way to be seen, to be included, and an indication of what needs to be done in order to achieve that. One area, which is about to embark on building a Black critique community, is the visual arts.
I'm Clothilde Bullen. I'm a Wadandi Barimaya woman from the southwest of Western Australia, but I currently live and work on Gadigal country in Sydney, New South Wales. I work and have worked for a long time as a curator. I'm currently the senior curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the Museum of Contemporary Art.
Clothilde has seen many changes in the nearly 2 decades she's been working in the gallery and museum space. From the increase in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander visual artists to the rise of art centres in remote areas, as well as the increase of Indigenous curators, like her, working in this sector. But what is still a work in progress is Indigenous visual arts critics.
One of the things that I've been working on personally is a thing called Indigenous Voices, the Indigenous Voices program. It was an idea that I came up with after seeing all of the work that had been done in this space before, particularly in the kind of literature space, and there are lots of people who have done good work long before I did. But one of the ideas I had was that we really needed some more visual arts writing. We've got some writing that focuses on the performance areas, but not so much visual art. So I felt that was really missing. And I was a board member for Art Monthly Australasia at the time, and I went to them and said, I've got this idea. I want to develop this project. Would you be in support of it? The board were entirely supportive. We applied for funding to the Australia Council and we got it funded for 2 years. So it's a pilot program. And the idea is to have mentors and mentees connected with each other. And then, and just unfortunately, COVID's gotten away, but have people travel to some of the major arts events that we have, like, the Telstra Award up in Darwin and Tunity Festival in Adelaide, and have those people travel to those events and start writing about the works that they're seeing and the exhibitions they're seeing, and having that person mentoring them through that process. So that person traveling with them as well. So it is running, but we won't be able to run it in August because the Darwin Art Fair is only online at the moment, but hopefully we'll get to Tunity in October.
Central to the Indigenous Voices program is language. Participants will be able to do their reviews in language first and then translate it into English. Clothilde says it means the review is approached in a different way from the outset because of the relationship between language and the brain. But it's also an approach which is happening internationally.
My background's actually in psychology, weirdly enough, but I came across to the arts, and believe me, it's very helpful working in this area. But one of the things in psychology is the way that their brains work is that when you're developing language, whatever language you develop, there are cultural schemas around that. So we end up thinking in particular ways dependent on the language that we speak. And if you speak multiple languages, you have multiple different schemas that you can operate off. So when people are able to speak in their own language, when people are able to write in their own language, what happens is there's a different way of thinking and a different way of seeing the world. Like if you're talking about a particular show or an artist from your community or whatever, you can really successfully talk about their cultural practice and embed it within your cultural worldview by speaking in language about it and to it. It's kind of a straightforward concept, but what happens is, you know, there's all this resistance to Australian languages, and that is what they are, because people don't understand them and people don't know them. And when you speak in language, you have different ideas and different concepts that go along with that, and you're forcing people to think in the way that you do, and people are quite resistant to that. So I want to see more of that. I want to see more people actually speaking in their language. I can give you an example because my language is Noongar. That's one of the language groups I belong to. And our word for country, which a lot of people might know, is Budja. Our word for being pregnant is Budjari, which means like you're born from the earth, you're born from country. And that's a concept that doesn't really exist in non-Indigenous culture. But to talk about it, you wouldn't talk about it necessarily in art criticism, or you might. But, you know, to make people understand how close that connection is with country, it's a way of explaining that. And you can only do that in language. So I think it's really critical.
When it comes to language reviews and criticisms, I mean, what's the international conversation around language critique and the way that it's being used elsewhere?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a fair bit of work happening in a variety of countries where First Nations people have got a bit more of a voice, particularly in Canada and the US, and also the Sami people, the Sami mob, are doing this work as well. And I'm actually just about to do a webinar with the International Association of Art Critics. So I'm on that board, the Australian contingent of that board. It's a UNESCO-funded and supported organisation. And the reason being is that we want to ensure that languages are preserved and held very carefully and tightly. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about in this webinar, and there's Sami mob that will be on there, and there's a whole range of people that are going to be participating. But one of the things that we're going to talk about is undertaking this work in not only Indigenous languages or First Nations languages, but also languages that, and this is a bit further down the path of thinking, but languages that are kind of written into the body as well. Basically, all blackfellas do storytelling, and our cultural material is always about storytelling in some way or another. And the way that some people do that is through performance and through bodily kind of inscribed performance. But that's also a kind of language. So we want to talk about that extension of language and the extension of the way we tell stories and express our cultural material. So I think that's where it's going. We want to broaden up that definition.
However, the question remains, is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community ready for art criticism from their own? For author Lisa Fuller, the answer isn't so straightforward.
There's a part of me that wants to say yes, just because I would really love to get that feedback, because I think it would be so different from the kind of feedback I've been getting and would be really valuable to me. But at the same time, you know, I was talking to someone about this today. You know, we can't really say anything, and by we I mean, you know, blackfellas. We don't really say anything negative about each other to mainstream Australia, because we know that'll be used against us or against the person we're talking about. So you never feel like you can really not take someone down, but you know what I mean? Like you can't be 100% honest because you're always worried about how that's going to play in mainstream Australia.
At some point, you do need to turn to things that you are unfamiliar with. And once you start doing that, you accumulate the ability to have an awareness and to have a community of peers. I think there are many voices also within communities. You know, just because a writer from a certain community talks about another writer who shares aspects of their identity doesn't mean that writer can pick up on every aspect of the writer's work, nor does it mean that they're even willing to have all of the hard conversations that writer might want them to engage when they're writing or reading their work. It's not as simple as own voices or you're one of us, and so you have a complete Encyclopedia Britannica knowledge of everything, and I trust you to engage. I think it's looking at the blind spots we all have as communities or individuals and saying, what don't I know, to appreciate the writing and the work that's there in front of me.
In some ways, I think we are, and in some ways, I think we're scared. And the reason I say that is because, blackfellas got to have solidarity. We've been through enough. We need to support each other. And so there is that idea for most Aboriginal people that you don't want to have it. You don't want to attack another person. You don't want to have a go at their work, because enough people have done that. So in the back of our minds, we don't want to hurt others. We don't want to betray others. We don't want to say something that's going to be interpreted wrongly. It's quite complex. People's feelings are quite complex about that. But I think there's a way to undertake art criticism that really is constructive and really is helpful, and it helps others learn and doesn't diminish the work or the practice being criticised. And it's not criticised in the usual sense where you're having a go at someone's way they dress or whatever. It's actually about if the work, for example, doesn't have that innovation or that spark that you wanted it to have, or, there's a whole range of different things. I think we'll get there, but I think we need to always remain kind and make everything constructive when we're talking about people's practice.
Clothilde's right. There's something in being kind when critiquing what your community creates. While this goes against the non-Indigenous construct of criticism in a way, it certainly says something to who we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We're so used to having every aspect of our lives put under the microscope that when it comes to supporting our own, whether that's in business, media, the arts, or on the sporting field, we'd rather point out what was done well than focus on the negative, because we know that will always exist. While many sectors of the arts still have a long way to go in how they engage with us and our work, does it have to be on their terms at all? As referenced in the name of this podcast, we've been building our own platforms when we were excluded by others. Our media allows our voices and reviews to be seen and heard, and surely that is the bigger journey that needs to be taken. Developing our own style of constructive criticism, which not only allows us to grow our practice, but which also supports us to do that in spaces where we feel safest. But more importantly, that our own community supports our spaces, which allows us to do that criticism work in our own way. While some may wish to be involved in the mainstream, and representation in these spaces is also important, perhaps there's a middle ground where the work can continue, but in a way which speaks to who we are, rather than the way it's always been done. But ultimately, the onus is on us to create and develop that Black critique community. Thanks to Senior Curator Clothilde Bullen, literary critic Declan Fry, author Lisa Fuller, music journalist Sosefina Fuamoli, Tila and Dr. Lilla Watson. This IndigenousX podcast has been made with the support of the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas. Make sure you subscribe to Black Nation on whatever podcast listening app you use, and remember, it's free to do so. I'm Rihanna Patrick. Thanks for joining me.